Rania Khalek. This event is sponsored by Massachusetts Peace Action. We want to build a more peaceful world by ending wars, abolishing nuclear weapons, and ending sanctions like the Caesar sanctions on Syria. We're joined today by Rania Khalek. Rania is a journalist. She is the producer and host at Soapbox. She's also the host of the podcast Begets. Rania is joining us live from Lebanon, so we're really excited to have her. At Mass Peace Action, we understand how the mainstream media does a poor job of informing the public about lots of things, including U.S. foreign policy. So we think it's important to hear from people and points of view that are marginalized by the corporate media and also by our Democratic and Republican parties. So that's why we invited Rania to hear from her, because her voice and point of view is marginalized. Um, so after we invited her, for me, this is maybe I've been involved in a few of these events now, but this is the first one where people have written us letters and called on us to cancel this event and deplatform our speaker. So among some parts of the left, some people consider Rania to be a controversial figure. I don't, but other people do. And well, anyways, Rania, thank you so much for joining us. And to get us started, and for those of us who are unfamiliar with your work, could you share with us some of your views about U.S. foreign policy in regards to Syria? And why is that? Why is your viewpoint? Why are you such a controversial figure? Why do people want us to cancel events with you and not even hear you speak?
Well, thank you for that lovely introduction. And yeah, I definitely would call myself, I'm a leftist and I'm an anti-imperialist. And that's the lens through which I view the world, including Syria. And that's the reason I take I think what should not be a controversial position on Syria, which is I oppose US intervention in that country. And I oppose the last decade long dirty war that the US has waged against Syria that has completely devastated the country. So there's the ideological aspect to it. There's the moral aspect to it. I just oppose war. And then there's the issue of I have a personal connection to Syria. My family's Lebanese and Syrian. I have family living in Syria that were directly impacted by this conflict and the reactionary insurgents that the US was arming and funding throughout it, and are now being impacted by the devastating starvation sanctions that the US is implementing against Syria. And I'm fine with people disagreeing with me. I'm fine with having a debate about these things. And I think it's very revealing that it's not that you're getting letters that, oh, we disagree with Rania, we want to see a debate. You're getting letters to say, we need to shut this down. This girl, sorry, there's a fly in my face. This girl needs to be canceled and deplatformed. And when there's people calling on those they disagree with to be canceled and deplatformed, and they're afraid to hear what that person has to say. So I really do applaud you for not giving into that, because I know that it can be it can feel there, you can feel pressured when you're receiving, letters and angry tweets from people and mean tweets from people. And I have been deplatformed and canceled on this issue in the past. So I applaud your bravery on this. And I also think it's interesting that, in 2021, the US is pretty much done funding insurgents in Syria. At this point, the war on Syria is one of economic terrorism and occupying part of the country, a country that's been devastated. It's a poor country where people don't have enough to eat and they don't have enough fuel. And so in 2021, to be having the same argument and to be so obsessed with controlling the narrative on Syria and shutting down any voice that challenges that is just pathetic.
Yeah, I agree. I think I think that the letter, like a few things that stuck out in the letter to me was, one, they called on us to just not even have you on, like we can't even listen to you. So and then the other thing that stuck out to me, at least, was that to basically smear you, they said that they basically tried to imply you're a paid Russian agent. The fact that you've spoken on Russia Today, that in itself was supposed to be like guilt by association, and we can't have you because of that. So But anyways, no, the credit goes to you for talking about these issues and for getting people so worked up. I don't think anything you said is should be that controversial, especially among the left and people who want peace
Well,
throughout the world.
I should also note though, like on top of that, I think it's important to recognize that this isn't just people who have, very strong feelings about Syria, though some of them that may be the case. There's also, and we can get into this when we talk about, propaganda, but there's also a well-funded effort to smear and character assassinate any prominent voice that comes out against these US regime change schemes. And that goes for Syria, that goes for Iran, that goes for Venezuela, whatever country people are speaking out about. There is a group of ardent pro-regime changers, pro-imperialists, and some among those people have inserted themselves into left circles. And that is really concerning because that has had a really devastating impact on the anti-war movement in the United States. But with Syria especially, I don't think there's any other issue except for maybe Venezuela, except for maybe Venezuela that has that where, when you speak out about it, you just have this really vicious, angry, well-funded apparatus that is out there to like hurt your reputation.
So these leftists who call for people like you to be deplatformed and canceled, isn't like, don't they see the irony in the fact that they're supposed to be on the left and in these ostensibly anti-war circles and stuff, but they're essentially siding with the U.S. empire position regarding the dirty war in Syria and even the position of the Israeli government, for example. So go ahead.
No, that's an excellent point. And that's why I don't actually think these people are leftists. I mean, if your number one concern, if your number one, like, if what you spend a significant amount of your time doing is smearing anti-war people as dictator lovers and genocide apologists while insinuating yourself into the left, then, I don't think you're actually a leftist. I think you're there to cause problems. And there's a lot of that. I mean, that's part of it. There's also people who, have certain left tendencies. And as a result, they tend to align with US State Department talking points when it comes to these adversary countries that the US is attacking. And then there's also, there's also paid elements of this. Like there's people who work for think tanks that receive funding from the State Department and funding from NATO, right? And funding from Gulf monarchies that maybe have domestic left positions as far as like domestic economic concerns go, but on international issues, they're just absolutely terrible. And that's why they're able to have jobs at these sort of, think tanks that align themselves with US empire.
Yeah, that's that's one of the worst parts to me, like this whole ecosystem of pushing US foreign policy essentially. Next up, I want to bring in Brian Garvey so for a couple questions about Syria. Brian.
Thanks, Amar, and thanks, Rania, for joining us. My question on Syria really has to do with the changing theory of military force that we've seen during the last 20 years, during this period of the global war on terror. I asked a similar question to Aaron Mate recently, that it's clear to me that the Bush administration went to great lengths to argue that Saddam Hussein and Iraq were a direct threat to the United States. This argument was around weapons of mass destruction and also their false claims that Saddam Hussein was associated with Al-Qaeda. I'm especially concerned that the argument of self-defense is not even made anymore. It seems that now the argument is purely about humanitarian intervention. We saw this in Libya. We saw arguments around this in Syria. Does this concern you? And why is it that we're arguing about how good a foreign government is when we talk about intervention instead of self-defense and war as a last resort?
So what you're talking about is basically the responsibility to protect doctrine, the R2P doctrine, which is right. This idea of invoking humanitarian intervention to justify, military intervention, which is exactly what happened with Libya. And I actually think that, the war on terror really changed the way America did war. It was like a new era in the sense of using the existence of Al-Qaeda and other, related extremist groups in different parts of the world, whether they were actually there or not, to justify this intervention, right? As you said, as a means of self-defense. But I think the responsibility to protect and like invoking humanitarian intervention was actually the US reverting to its Cold War doctrine, right? Because that's what the US would do during the Cold War. Was go around saying, well, we have to protect these people. They're being, slaughtered. They would even like make things up about what the Cubans were doing in Africa, or it was kind of like reverting to that. And also, I think that works really well on liberals. It's not a coincidence that you saw that humanitarian intervention doctrine really implemented under Barack Obama and his team, people like Samantha Power, because liberals operate under a different framework to a degree than conservatives. And for liberals, the liberal interventionist mindset really is convincing for them because they have like convinced themselves that they really are out to civilize the world. So I think that's why you saw that humanitarian intervention aspect as opposed to making everything about the war on terror. I think Obama really signified, except for maybe with the extent of like fighting ISIS, really signified the beginning of the end of the war on terror in many ways, because they moved from that war on terror framework to actually the humanitarian intervention framework. But the irony of that is that what the humanitarian intervention framework actually entails is, at least in the Middle East, it entailed arming and funding extremist groups and reactionary groups and jihadists, arming and funding the very people that we invoked in 2001 to justify a war that, that enveloped the world. So that's the irony of that. And I think it's the biggest scandal of this century so far, is that you had this, we started out the 2000s with this Al-Qaeda attack on 9/11, and then you began after the first decade, and in 2011, the US began a strategy of arming and funding that people who abide by that same ideology to carry out terrorist attacks in countries that it wanted to overthrow and collapse. And all under the guise of humanitarian intervention. And then the other ironic aspect of that is to have people claiming to be on the left, or even people who claimed, that they're so liberal, supporting these reactionary groups who are literally like, they're religious fascists. I think it was completely outrageous. It's a huge scandal. And I think if more Americans knew that their government had one of the biggest covert operations in history, funding and arming Al-Qaeda linked groups to destroy and collapse Syria, and actually led to the rise of ISIS, you would have a lot of anger, rightly so, at what the US government did, because it made the entire Middle East less safe, and actually ultimately it made the whole world less safe.
I agree, and we saw I see that people are talking about former now Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard in the thread. I know that the piece of legislation that she introduced was the Stop Arming Terrorists Act, and her efforts to bring this to the public debate got her smeared and labeled as both an Assad apologist and as a Russian asset while she was serving in the U.S. military as a major in the National Guard. Can you talk about the dangers? You know them very well, to bringing these things up, and what can be done to smear anti-war voices that bring these things up?
No, that's an excellent point, because I will say I used to spend a lot of my time covering the issue of Israel-Palestine. I worked for the Electronic Intifada, and so I had experience dealing with the Israel lobby, right? With anybody who wants to shut you down and smear you because you're challenging Israeli crimes against Palestinians. And I thought I'd seen the worst of it, but I've never experienced more smears and character assassination and reputation destruction and libel the way I did when I started speaking out on Syria. it just completely just like threats like I'd never received before, but also just like threatening to my livelihood. Like there are academics in senior tenured positions who went around basically trying to make sure that I could never speak at their universities, to make sure that I got, I didn't get jobs, to make sure that, nobody that like they say so much about you that it gets to the point where people don't want to associate with you kind of situation. I'd never experienced that before the issue of Syria. And I mean, I think it just demonstrates like what a threat it was, to speak so openly about it. But that's just me. Like I'm just some like left-wing, independent journalist. Not to minimize that, but like I'm not a congressperson. So like, that really shows you the level of coordinated propaganda and character assassination that there was around the issue of Syria, that you had a congresswoman, a sitting member of Congress, be smeared as a Russian asset by people in her own party. I mean, like I think the issue of Syria actually speaking out on it ruined Tulsi Gabbard's chance to move up in the Democratic Party and to continue a political career, at least right now. I mean, she's not going to have another term as a congressperson. She was very popular before she started speaking out against Syria. So I raise this because I think it's important, like, to ask, whenever you see people being attacked like this on an issue, it's time to look more deeply into that issue and understand why, because it's very revealing once you start to see why.
So that is my question. Why are they attacking you like that? And why is this topic of Syria so contentious, even among the left? Why can't we bring you on and at least hear you out or even debate you? Why do they want to silence you on this topic of Syria?
I mean, they don't want the mainstream narrative to be challenged. They want people to support war on Syria. They want people to support the collapse of the Syrian state. And people have different reasons for wanting that to happen. There's no like black and white answer here. There's several answers. And one of the answers, outside of the left, is the money. Syria was one of the most heavily propagandized wars, I think, in history. And it was largely because of the amount of money that was being spent on creating media around it. So what I mean to say by that is, Syria became such a dangerous place. The opposition held areas of Syria because if you went there, you would be like kidnapped and possibly, sold and possibly beheaded, right? So journalists weren't really able to travel to opposition areas anymore by like 2013, 2014, because they were seeing, people get kidnapped and by 2014 get, sold to ISIS and beheaded. So what you had governments, the European governments, the UK Foreign Office, the US, basically funded a media apparatus of Syrian opposition media that was then fed into the Western narrative. I even have, I wrote an article back in like 2016 or 2017. I had a colleague of mine had been offered $17,000 a month to basically write propaganda for a Syrian opposition group in Gaziantep that was paid for by the UK Foreign Office. That's the kind of money that was going into creating media around Syria. So I think the propaganda around Syria had people convinced of a certain narrative. So that was like one aspect of it. And also with journalists, Western journalists, they weren't able to travel into some of them were, but not all the time. They weren't able to get into like the government side of Syria, and they weren't able to get to the opposition side of Syria. But there was so much money going into funding opposition media. The Syrian government wasn't really concerned with what the outside thought of the war. They were more concerned with what domestically people thought of the war. So a lot of Western journalists were only receiving information from one side, the opposition side. So they all had this bias on top of already being sort of like pro-Western in their thinking. They already had this bias, this built-in bias towards the opposition, which was reflected pretty dramatically in their reporting. And then you have like the think tank industry, right? Which, like I mentioned before, basically it's all funded by the State Department, weapons companies, Gulf monarchies to push this propaganda as well. And then you have ideology. You have sort of like this weaponized immigrant population of Arabs who have a certain, there was a huge fight in the Arab American community about Syria. I don't think I had ever experienced like sectarian hatred in the American Arab community until the war in Syria that I ever felt that, because I come from like a minority group. And the Syrian situation not only sectarianized the Middle East in a way it hadn't been before, but also the Arab American community. So there was a sort of like that identity ideology played a role as well. You also have a huge Syrian exile community in the US who were like Syrian elites that had their land taken away by the Ba'athist Party and like redistributed. They're in the US. There are still, elites in the US, but they're angry about that. They want their land back. They want their stuff back. This is an opportunity. It's also an opportunity to maybe, become a leader in Syria if the regime does fall. That's what some people have in mind, right? So there's that aspect to it. And there's also, Syrians, and not just Syrians, but others who have, sympathies with the Muslim Brotherhood. And the Muslim Brotherhood in Syria and outside of it was very much pro-opposition, right? That was sort of like the leading part of it in the beginning. And there's those sympathies played a role in certain American Muslim groups having positions on Syria where they demanded a no-fly zone and things like this. So there's like so much that goes into it. And then on the left, I think just an ignorance of the conflict. And after 10 years of being on the left and understanding the war on terror is wrong, what the US is doing around the world is wrong. I think that seeing like the Syrian government and groups like Hezbollah, in countries like Iran employ the war on terror rhetoric in the aspect of Syria and Iraq made people on the left in the US uncomfortable because they spent the last 10 years hating the war on terror. But I think there's a difference because the US had this like made up threat of Al-Qaeda where it was like going to other countries to destroy them. Whereas countries like Iraq and Syria and Iran actually had a legitimate threat inside their countries doing like suicide bombings and trying to take over areas. But anyways, I think the left had a difficult time wrapping their heads around that after 10 years of like understanding that the war on terror is wrong. And then you have just different left tendencies and ideologies on the left. There's people who on the left who like support the regime change schemes in Venezuela and Syria because they think everything's a revolution that should be supported and every protest should be supported, no matter like if it's right wing or left wing. I know I went all over the place, but there's just not one easy answer for this question.
Yeah, totally. John Ratliff has a comment here in the chat. Let me just read it out. He says, there may be divisions on the Syrian left, which also fuel some of the pushback to our anti-imperialist position. I guess so. The question is, in your experience or in your reporting, what views do leftist Syrians have about U.S. foreign policy in Syria, and not just leftist Syrians, but Syrian society at large?
I mean, Syria
and
is
Amar,
not...
if I could sneak in, you should have mentioned the word Rojava, which John had mentioned in his question.
Okay.
So there's not that... Okay. Syria, I'm not like an expert on internal Syrian dynamics of ideology, but in my experience, there isn't ideological diversity in Syria because it's like a kind of a one-party country. People, there's not like a Syrian left, right? There's not like a Syrian right and a Syrian left like you would see in the US. It doesn't really work like that. There's a lot of what you'll read about from the Syrian left are people who don't live in Syria, or Syrians who maybe left Syria years ago. And then you mentioned the issue of the Kurdish areas, Rojava, where as it's called, where the YPG is in charge. People have different opinions on that. I wouldn't really call them leftist. It's interesting, the sort of like self-government structure that they've implemented. But there's some cultish aspects to it too. But people get really worked up about this issue, so I don't want to go too deep into it. Some people see the YPG as leftist, but like others don't. And I think both sides have varying degrees of decent points they make. But at the end of the day, the YPG in Syria, which is a branch of the PKK, is working alongside the US to occupy a part of Syria, to occupy a part of Eastern Syria. And as a result, they've occupied the most resource-rich part of Syria, where there's a lot of grain and a lot of oil. And the whole point of, they're basically like working on behalf of the US to do that. And what the US gets out of that is it basically denies the Syrian government its own resources. The Syrian government has to then spend money buying grain and buying wheat and buying oil from its own land at a time when it doesn't have a very well functioning economy because of US sanctions. So there's a lot of contradictions in that, in calling that like a sort of leftist situation that should be supported, in my opinion.
Okay. Yoav is asking, I assume that there was initially a popular rebellion against Assad. How was this rebellion militarized and by whom?
So there, of course, I mean, there was this like fervent feeling across the Middle East after what happened in Tunisia and after what's happening in Egypt. People were, I wouldn't say rebelling. That's a strong word. I would say protesting for more rights, especially in Syria, for more political freedoms. However, in Syria, it very, very quickly became violent on both sides. But of course, in the US narrative, we only ever hear that the regime was violent, right? We never hear about the violence from the opposition. I actually would equate it to an even worse situation than what you saw at the US Capitol last week. Everybody was horrified, rightly so, by these like people, storming into the US Capitol and like being very violent and angry and beating up police. That's something similar that you did see in a lot of parts of Syria. They would storm in like places like Dara, they would storm government buildings and police stations. And there was like shooting and, it was very quickly armed on like an individual level. But what made the Syrian conflict so terrible was the outside intervention. It was outside countries very, very quickly seeing an opportunity and arming the opposition, arming their own militias. And that is what caused the war. And that is what prolonged it for so long, is the flow of those weapons from Qatar, from Turkey, from Saudi Arabia, from America. Anyways, it just got worse and worse from there. I mean, Syria could have had a different trajectory that could have been much more positive had it not been for so many countries intervening the way they did.
Yeah. With Joe Biden winning the presidential election and taking office soon, and the Democrats having the House and the Congress and the Senate, what do you think Joe Biden's policies will be towards Syria?
So I think that you're not going to see that much change on Syria. You're going to see a kind of continuation. The sanctions aren't going to go away. I think the Caesar Act would have been passed under a Democratic administration. Democrats voted for it overwhelmingly, which are just these like really horrendous sanctions on Syria that even prevent its neighboring countries from trading with it. So Syria, Lebanon won't trade with Syria now because they're afraid of sanctions. Iraq, I mean, it's like somebody threatening to sanction Canada or Mexico if they trade or do business with the US. That's what the US is imposing on Syria. It's like a siege. I think you're going to see that continue. You might see a little bit loosening, like a few less sanctions, because at this point, the US under Trump has sanctioned everyone in Syria. I mean, the health minister in Syria was sanctioned in the middle of a pandemic. Like, what I don't understand. I don't even understand from like a BS like humanitarian perspective how sanctioning the health minister during a pandemic can possibly have any legitimacy to it whatsoever. It's just sadistic. So I think maybe there'll be slightly less sadism in the policy, but you're going to see those sanctions continue to be implemented. I think what you'll see with the Biden administration that will be different from Trump will be more around the issue of Iran. A lot of the people that Biden has appointed were involved in negotiating the Iran nuclear deal. And they have like an attachment to it on like an emotional level because they like lost sleep trying to negotiate it for months on end. So they want to return to that deal. And so that will, a return to that deal, if it does happen under Biden, will impact Syria in the sense that Iran will be able to help Syria maybe economically or like with trade. If it can go back to being like, having a more functioning economy, because right now it doesn't. And also Lebanon, the economic collapse of Lebanon has really dramatically impacted Syria because, Syria's been under these severe sanctions. Lebanese banks were the way that like Syria got money. Because Lebanon acted kind of like a middleman, right? Like it had connection to the West, but also to Syria because it was its neighbor. But now that the economy's collapsed and the banks have collapsed, a lot of Syrians have lost money in Lebanon. The collapse of the currency, and that's also how Syria was getting dollars, was through Lebanon, and now Lebanon has a dollar shortage. So one of the things that's made the economic collapse in Lebanon worse is this maximum pressure campaign from Donald Trump. So Biden will likely not reverse it, but put a little bit of a halt to it. So if Lebanon is given a little bit of a lifeline, it does give somewhat of a lifeline to Syria.
So, and what do you think Biden's policies will be towards Yemen and Venezuela?
I mean, on Yemen, the Donald Trump administration, under the whole, maximum pressure campaign, just sanctioned the Houthis in Yemen. The Houthis control some like 80%. I think like the 80% of the population lives in Houthi-controlled areas in Yemen. And Yemen imports almost everything it needs. It's like a completely aid-dependent nation. So by sanctioning the Houthis, they just basically guaranteed more Yemenis will starve to death. And the thing about sanctions is they're very difficult to reverse. So I'm not sure what Biden can legally reverse, though I do, from what I understand from the people that are going to be in his administration, there is support for ending the war in Yemen. And there has been support in the US for ending the war in Yemen because the US has nothing to gain from it. Even as like an imperial power at this point, it has nothing to gain from it. It's basically just continuing because Saudi Arabia wants it to continue. And the UAE wants it to continue. So there might be, and you might see an end to the war in Yemen, but I don't know, Yemen will kind of still be a country under siege. So there is a little bit of hope for Yemen under a Biden administration. I don't see much change with Venezuela policy. When it comes to Latin America, both parties, there's very little difference between them. If anything, the US tends to be a more effective imperial power towards Latin American countries when it comes to being under democratic control. It was under Obama that the pink tide was sort of like swept away with these destabilization campaigns from like, in Honduras and Ecuador and other countries. So I think you'll continue to see this sort of like sanctions that started under Obama and continued under Trump. I think they'll continue under Joe Biden, and you'll continue to see US support for the feckless opposition in Venezuela.
And then on domestic policy and COVID response, do you think the Democrats will pass the $2,000 check, or will it be blocked by someone like Joe Manchin? And will he be the new foil now about why we can't have good things because of Joe Manchin?
Yes, he will. He'll be like the new Joe Lieberman. And they'll, Democrats will just blame him for everything they can't get done. From what I saw today, Joe Biden seems had to have, already fallen back on what he said. He mentioned, he expressed some support for the $2,000 check, but now it's down to $1,400, and who knows if that'll even happen. I don't have very much faith in a Biden administration taking us very far. I don't think I'm happy that Donald Trump won't be in charge anymore, but I'm also extremely concerned that you have one of the most right-wing Democrats who's going to be president, and that party has zero interest in reflecting on any of the reasons why Trump came to power in the first place. And I really do fear that come the next, the end of the next 4 years, or if Biden, Kamala Harris make it 8 years, you're going to have a way more effective demagogue than Donald Trump come along and just, completely capitalize on the Democrats throwing away an opportunity like they're already doing now and going to do, which is returning to like this sort of miserable status quo that is pushing everybody into more and more economic precarity.
Yeah, and that economic precarity helps somebody like Trump when they run for election. Okay, I have hold on. Okay, I see Phil Nichols has his hand raised, so I want to call on Phil to ask his question. Can I just request that we keep the questions brief to give Rania as much speaking time as we can? Phil.
Thanks. Many years ago, when the U.S. invaded Iraq, it was this talk about getting international approval, international support, and what it really amounted to, what I've seen over the years, is it's the United States as an imperial power saying, we are going to go in and protect the people, or we are going to go in and change a bad government for a good government. So it seems to me, however, that if the United States, instead of being this imperial power, said, we are going to be the lead power, but we're going to involve all of the interested parties in the Middle East, in South America, and we'll step back and join a real coalition with these people to have whatever kind of investigations of human rights violations and need to be done, and then the action taken there. So two questions. One, is this true? And secondly, is there any chance that the world could change where an international body like the United Nations could be involved in these types of issues?
So I think it's important to remember, the US is not a humanitarian organization. It's an imperialist power. It's a global empire. And it is not interested in saving people or helping people. It's interested in securing resources and wealth for elites in its own country and its corporations and the various monopolies that run America. And we always have to remember that. That is what the military is for. And that is what the U.S. that is what guides U.S. policy around the world. The U.S. doesn't care about human rights. If it did, it wouldn't be best friends with Saudi Arabia, which still beheads people in 2021 and hangs their headless bodies up on cranes to send a message to the rest of the population, not to challenge the laws. You can see it in all the countries the U.S. is friends with are human rights abusers. But I do think what you're talking about, in an ideal world, yes, you would have an international body like the United Nations that could, lead to this sort of cooperative effort. And that's actually what the U.S. is scared of. And that's why the U.S. is moving from these sort of conflicts it's had the last 20 years with the war on terror in countries, like Iran and certain countries in Latin America. It's moving a little bit away from that and more towards this great power competition with China, because it sees a threat. The US as an empire sees a threat in a multipolar world where a country like China or Russia can be on a level playing field, and then these countries have to work together and make decisions together. The US wants to be the global hegemon. So I think moving forward, as a result of that, what you're going to see is actually an increasingly dangerous world where the US is escalating against Russia and China. I mean, the last decade, what the US did in Syria, there were so many times where the US and Russia came close to directly hitting each other in Syria. The US is playing a lot of dangerous games when it comes to these kinds of proxy wars. And now it's moving towards that kind of escalation with China because it fears China as this rising economic power. And I think COVID and the just disastrous response by the US to COVID versus China's response, which was getting the disease under control, has really accelerated the decline of the US and the rise of China. So the US is going to feel more in a corner and more likely to lash out in really dangerous ways. And I think that that's actually what I'm concerned about moving into a Biden administration, because, Trump's had this crazy trade war against China. And I think you're going to see sort of a more effective escalation against China from Donald Trump. And we should be having these sort of global powers cooperating with each other.
Okay, Jeff mentioned in the chat how Samantha Power got picked to head Biden's USAID. Could you comment on that? What can we, based on Biden's cabinet picks and stuff, what can we determine about his foreign policy?
So Samantha Power she's a huge supporter of liberal interventionism. And the USAID is almost a perfect role for her because it's a CIA cutout that just funds civil society groups to destabilize countries internally. It also has some nice projects on the side. I've seen there's some USAID projects, for example, in Lebanon to keep this or that lake clean or something. So there's to build a soccer field. So there's those kinds of projects. But more what the USAID is all about is really funding and providing resources to civil society groups to destabilize adversary governments. And this role is perfect for Samantha Power because that's the kind of stuff she supports. When she was the UN ambassador under Obama, I mean, she was just at the US and constantly instigating or constantly, demanding we like do no-fly zones in Syria and intervention in Syria. She was always pushing for intervention. So I actually think it's fitting for her. And I'm also in a way relieved that she doesn't have like a higher level position. Because I don't think the person running USAID is necessarily going to be in the room to, maybe she will be, I don't know, but that's not necessarily a position that ends up in the room whispering in Joe Biden's ear about whether or not he should bomb this or that country. That said, I mean, I'm not excited about Joe Biden's foreign policy team. The man that he hired as his defense secretary sits on the board of Raytheon. So you have one of the country's biggest weapons companies basically working inside the Defense Department now, which is that typical revolving door. That said, like there's some positions that he could have picked much more hawkish people. He picked Anthony Blinken as Secretary of State, who is somebody that is obviously in the revolving door. He's supported like every intervention. He supported, no-fly zone in Syria. He supported intervention in Libya. He actually helped whip votes for Joe Biden when he worked for him in the Senate for the Iraq War. So this is a dangerous figure in the sense that he's pro-war, but also, I guess it's better than Susan Rice, who's way more hawkish. So like with the Biden administration, it's just a bunch of lesser evils, which is not a good place to be. But I think that you're going to see like a kind of continuation of the Obama years. And that's not a good thing in terms of foreign policy. The Obama years gave us the dirty war on Syria. So you're just going to see a continuation of American empire under these cabinet picks. And a lot of the same figures are going to be involved.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. And we see that, when Trump's Secretary of Defense was Mark Esper, the lobbyist from Raytheon, and now Biden's coming in and his Secretary of Defense is also from Raytheon, as you mentioned. We have this Raytheon continuity.
They run, it's like these corporations run our government. Like it's so ridiculous that we even think we live in some democracy that should be spreading anything around the world, or should be like trying to recreate it in any other country. We don't live in a democracy. It's like the biggest sham in our country is the idea that just because we all get to vote, for two people who are funded by billionaires, we live in some sort of democracy. It's just not true. We live in a country literally like it's like a corporate tyranny and we don't even realize it.
So are you telling me that you don't have faith in these agents of Raytheon to bring peace and justice throughout the world?
I have faith that these agents of Raytheon will increase their bottom line. Oh. They'll sell more Raytheon bombs. Raytheon stocks are going to go up, right? Like, I mean, it's just, and this is what makes me sad about, I mentioned earlier about how I'm worried about what you're going to see in another 4 to 8 years in terms of like a demagogue more effective than Trump, is we live in this corporate tyranny, but we don't really have a left media apparatus that's able to reach enough people to explain the conditions of what's happening around them. What you have instead is corporate media that lies, and then right-wing media that really gets to capitalize on all the angst. People know something is like deeply wrong with the structure of our society, and they have a healthy skepticism of what they're being told about it, but they're gravitating towards these right-wing media outlets that are funded by really rich people, and the left just doesn't have that. So that's why I worry so much, because if the left had widespread viewership and widespread audience the way the right does, we'd be a lot better off, but that's just not the case.
Yeah, and that point you make about how well-funded the right-wing media ecosystem is, we also see that happening online with new media, with things like Prager University. So, I think it's great how actually people like you are countering that with your TikToks and memes and stuff like that. So it's really, that's another reason we wanted to bring you on here. Okay, next up, I'll pass the floor to Brian.
Thanks, Amar. Sort of on the same vein of this corporate control of both parties. I'm sure you're aware that we're especially concerned with Raytheon here in Massachusetts because their global headquarters is about 5 miles from where I'm sitting right now in Waltham,
Belly of the beast.
Massachusetts. Yeah, it comes with certain benefits because you're able to call it out directly. But you made a great video recently on the CIA and how it's trying to reframe itself. We've also seen this with Raytheon, as we actually joined in a coalition called the Raytheon Anti-War Campaign to work specifically on Yemen. And one of the things that we found is that while Raytheon is helping to create this greatest famine in the world, locally here in Massachusetts, they're also a major sponsor of the Walk for Hunger, which is a major charitable event to end hunger here in Massachusetts. So can you talk about a little of this woke washing that these corporations and government agencies are doing, and how damaging that can be?
I love that, woke washing. That's a fantastic term. And that's exactly what it is. It's woke washing. It's like, the weapons companies, I'm sure Raytheon has a float at the Gay Pride Parade every year. I always see like a Lockheed Martin one in Washington, D.C. They've been doing this for a long time. I think that really the last 20 years, especially the last 10, you've seen not just with corporations and weapons companies, you've also seen it obviously with the Democratic Party, right? This woke washing, it's just this really cheap way to look like you're doing good to cover up for all the bad you're doing. So if we just support, the CIA coming out with this new, like, we want more diverse people working for us. That's literally like what they're saying. And they have pictures of like women of color saying this is the new CIA, right? We're rebranding. It's woke washing because at the end of the day, this organization remains one with a very destructive agenda that like goes around the world destabilizing and funding Contras and doing special operations and spying and destroying infrastructure. And the same, I really think that the last 10 years you've seen this woke washing taken to a next level where the Democratic Party has done a really good job of using it against the left, against like rising support for progressivism within the Democratic Party, the sort of left wing of the party. They've used it to suppress that wing by putting forward people like Hillary Clinton and then calling you sexist if you don't support her, by appointing a half Indian, half Black woman to be Joe Biden's vice president, so that you're now racist and sexist if you don't support Joe Biden, and also like Biden appointing all of these women, and I think he has like one trans appointee, and I think people are seeing through it, but like especially with Joe Biden, it worked better under like when Hillary Clinton was running because she was an actual woman. But Joe Biden's just this like old right-wing white guy, so it doesn't work quite as well under him. I think people are starting to see through it after 10 years of like smearing people as racist and sexist if they don't get on board to like supporting capitalism and imperialism. I think it's kind of run its course. I hope it's run its course. I think people now really recognize that, like, just seeing, it's nice to see yourself, if you're from a minority group, it's nice to see yourself reflected in positions of power, but that doesn't actually materially change your life at all. It just is nice. Like, it's nice, I guess. It's sure. Like, it would be cool to see someone named Rania, I guess, whatever. But like, that doesn't mean anything for me. I still have student loan debt, Like, I'd rather like some white person be in charge and cancel my student loan debt than to have someone who looks and talks like me increase my interest rate.
Yeah, totally. Well, speaking of Raytheon, let's not forget, as Mike mentions here, all the good work they do in STEM training programs for the Girl Scouts and the Girl Scout cookies. So, anyways, Brian, do you want to pull some of the questions from the audience or from the chat?
Sure. But just to follow up, I would be remiss if I did. I know Paul will be upset with me if I don't plug the big International Day of Action for Yemen that is coming up on the 25th of this month, right during the first week of Biden's new administration. He's promised to end that war in Yemen and stopped and stop arms sales to Saudi Arabia and the UAE. We want to put pressure on him to make sure that he does so, and we're just incredibly concerned at his pick for Pentagon chief, that he comes straight from Raytheon. So we'll be giving everyone a link to how you can participate on January the 25th, because it is a chance for us to end the worst humanitarian crisis in the world that has a lot to do with the United States and a lot to do with Massachusetts and Raytheon. I would ask if people want to ask a question live, you can go to the participants button on the bottom of your screen and then click raise hand. And we would love to call on a few people if you have questions for Rania.
Jeff has his hand raised, so let's pass the floor to Jeff. Jeff, can you unmute? I think Jeff's computer might be frozen. So
Yeah.
we'll come back to Jeff. Let's take a question from John Ratliff. There's John. John, you have to unmute as well.
Don't you just love Zoom, everyone?
Sorry, can people hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, great. This is a little off the direct topic. It's a question I asked another speaker we had when he was talking about Syria. It strikes me, especially after the enormous crisis that has struck Lebanon and the massive popular involvement in Lebanon, seeking changes there, and very similar histories and relationships with empire. I wonder if there's any way that Lebanon and Syria could together seek a better future, reconstruction, a stronger relationship moving forward. I realize the history has, mainly because of imperialism, has been tricky between the two countries, but I wondered if there's any hope moving forward together.
There should be. There absolutely should be. Lebanon is, I mean, look, these countries have artificial borders that were drawn by imperial powers, that were drawn by the British and the French. And their borders completely man-made. Lebanon is just this like little slice of a country. It's like a port country on the Mediterranean Sea, and Syria is way bigger. And together they could have everything they need. I mean, Lebanon has the ports, right? Syria has productive capacity. It has like a labor force. It has factories. Until the war on Syria, the last 10 years, Syria was self-sufficient in producing its own medicines. Now it has to import everything. But it has factories, pharmaceutical factories. It makes its own clothes, its own shoes. Syria was famous for making its own socks that they would like import, or they would export to Turkey. They grow their own food. Lebanon has this banking infrastructure that's obviously collapsing right now, but it could be useful for financial reasons. And until the Beirut port blast, a lot of what was going into Syria was coming in through the Beirut port. So these countries should be able to have a normal relationship and work together regionally. And not just Syria and Lebanon, Iraq as well. Iraq has great agricultural production and it's rich in oil, right? It produces all this oil. It has like the biggest oil reserves in the region. But because of these imperial powers, these countries have not only been given these false borders, but also, in Lebanon, it's a very polarized country. Half the country is pro-Hezbollah, is pro-resistance, is pro-Iran, is against, Israel. The other half of the country is pro-America, pro-Saudi Arabia. and this part of this political, I'm talking politically, not like the actual individuals of the country, but politically the country is very fractured. And this side of the political parties in Lebanon that, you know, work with the United States and work with the Saudis are obstructionists when it comes to working with the Syrians. They are basically just tools of the Americans. So they, you know, block that from ever happening. They absolutely despise and hate Syria. They hate Iran. I mean, you know, Lebanon had a fuel crisis last year where I think there was like electricity cuts that were like in the center of Beirut. The center of the capital, there were electricity cuts up to like 20 hours a day in the middle of summer. If anybody's been to Beirut in the summertime, it is, you can't breathe outside. It's too humid and hot. And even at this time when the population was really suffering, even elites didn't have electricity, you still had a refusal by the pro-Western political elements in this country to accept free oil from Iran. like that's that. So that's the sort of obstructionism that you're dealing with when it comes to cooperation between these two countries. But it absolutely is in Lebanon's interest. It's in Syria's interest. It's in Iraq's interest. It's in Iran's interest to have this sort of regional cooperation. But the Gulf countries with their American partners and the Israelis prevent this, and it behooves them for these countries to be split up the way they are. I would like to see hope. You asked if there's hope. I would like to, I mean, I'm hopeful that at some point, because it's like a logical end game, like at some point existentially, you know, you have to work together or else people won't have enough to eat. But, you know, tools of empire within these countries are also very powerful. So it's, you know, kind of like you have to wait and see.
Thanks, Rania. So we only have about 15 minutes left of this event. So what we'll do is I'll call on, we'll take a question from Val, we'll take a question from Francis Yasmin, and if we have time, we'll take a question from Omar, and we'll get ready to close this off. Val, can you unmute yourself, please? And do you not have a question? Or
I do, yes. Thank you
Okay.
very much. Rania, first of all, thank you for your excellent talk. I mean, I was really looking forward to this, and I'm very sorry that you're having, you know, these difficulties from these, you know, dreadful people. I think you did actually address part of my question. But before I get to my question, I do want to endorse what you were saying about the biased nature of the media. I remember running into an NPR journalist in 2012 at an event in Boston, and I asked why it was that I never heard any interviews with Syrian government officials, and it was only with members of opposition. And, you know, she really couldn't answer my question other than to say that, well, it's a terrible regime. And frankly, I also ended my subscription to The Guardian because I was just appalled by their approach as well, very early on. But my question, Rania, does have to do with Lebanon and Lebanese-Syrian relations. You are absolutely right that there is a great deal of economic complementarity there, and actually the region as a whole. I mean, I teach Middle East studies, and, you know, I'm pushing this idea that, you know, the region could do very, very well if there were trade relations. But as you said, the divide and conquer tactics, of course. But in the past, Lebanese tended to be, and all the Lebanese I knew were very anti-Syrian. You know, that was sort of, you know, at the tail, you know, at the end, in the years after the, you know, in the 1990s, let's put it that way. I understand, for example, from my Lebanese mechanic, that has changed. That, but is it true? Is it true that most Lebanese now actually do support the Syrian government in the context of this battle, you know, between the reactionaries and, you know, the outside for the Islamist opposition, their foreign backers, and then the government? Yeah.
So it really depends who you ask, because the thing about Lebanon is that people have these sort of familial ties to political parties. Lebanon is a country where every party, every sect, right, has like representation in government. It's a sectarianized government system. So the party really that you grow up in, that your family's a part of, like the sect you're a part of, really defines your politics domestically. I'm not saying that's the case for everybody, but that helps explain why, like, one Lebanese person can have a certain view and another could have another view that's completely opposite. And it really is about the political party that they grew up around. with the Syria issue, Syria was involved in the Lebanese civil war. There was a period of time where it actually like occupied part of Lebanon. Some Lebanese supported that, others opposed it, depending on what political party they were aligned with and how it benefited their village or their town. So it's not like a black and white issue. That said, with the rise of this insurgency in Syria that really threatened the security of Lebanon, had it not been for Hezbollah in Lebanon, you would have had ISIS in Beirut. I mean, there was bombing attacks in Beirut, mostly against Shia areas, because that's who ISIS likes to attack. But you know, Hezbollah really, the reason for their involvement in the war in Syria wasn't just to support a government that they're aligned with, who supports them, but it was more for Lebanon's security, because Lebanon shares a very loose border with Syria, and you know, ISIS and Al-Qaeda in Lebanon would have been, you know, detrimental to this country. And it was in this country. They fought battles here. And the irony of that, the reason I bring that up, is there are Christian parties in Beirut, in Lebanon, that hate Syria and are allied with the West, right? They're allied with the United States. These parties wanted Al-Qaeda to win in Syria, despite what that would mean for Lebanon. Like they couldn't see the contradiction. They couldn't, and that always amazed me, is you actually had like minority groups, depending on what political party they were a part of in Lebanon, they were in support. I mean, even the leader of the Druze community in Lebanon, Walid Jumblat, was like telling the Druze in Syria, like, chill out, like you should ally with Al-Qaeda, as their villages were surrounded by Al-Qaeda, because he hates the Syrian government that much. So Lebanon is a very peculiar place in terms of its political polarizations, and it would require like longer than 5 minutes to discuss like the different complexities of that. But I hope that answers a little bit. And that sort of mentality is also what, like I mentioned, really obstructs the sort of economic and regional cooperation we were talking about within these countries. But there are a lot of Lebanese that support the Syrian state. There are a lot of Lebanese that don't necessarily support the Syrian government, but like they just don't support state collapse, because who wants a state who wants a country next door that has complete chaos and anarchy that poses a huge threat to you? You know, of course you don't want the state next door to collapse. It just leads to a power vacuum and a bunch of fighting, a bunch of like militias constantly shooting at each other, and you don't want that anywhere near you. You wouldn't want that in the US either. So that's, I think, the general view people in Lebanon probably have, and then it goes one way or the other depending on which party they might be affiliated with.
Thanks, Rania, and thanks, Val, for that question. Francis, do you want to
So
take the next one?
first, I just got to say a huge thanks, Rania, for this, for being here, for being so open and sharing with us. Thank you to Massachusetts Peace Action for putting this event together. And so a couple things I think are good to remember. One, that the Biden administration, like the Obama administration, at least we have a seat at the table. At least there will be public engagement. At least there was an office of public engagement that will have meetings that we can attend, you know? So we got to remember that over the last 4 years, we had a Trump administration that was completely opposed to engagement. So we got to remember that we have a lot of opportunities, obviously. And another thing I think to remember is violence begets violence. You know, it's not that one side is the wrong one. It's everyone who continues to choose violence is perpetuating the cycle of violence. And I think obviously the people who win are the arms manufacturers. And I'm glad that, you know, we're having that part of that conversation. And right now it's been incredible to see suddenly they're drawing a line. The coup was too much. Suddenly they've stopped donating to their candidates, right? They've put them on blast. So I was just thinking, my question is that, like, so this moment where Raytheon and whatnot, there's a media opportunity, obviously, for us, great opportunity for letters to the editor and opinion pieces about this hook. It's in the news. But what other opportunities do you see for, I guess, citizen diplomacy, as I like to think about it? How can we engage, particularly with Syria and Lebanon, in a constructive way that builds bridges and, you know, gets us closer to peace and cooperation?
I mean, I'm not an organizer. I'm not like an activist. So I actually feel like you guys would know better than I would on what you do. But I think it's a really important point you made about a seat at the table. I'm not necessarily one to say we can push Biden left, but I think it's very, very important to recognize that that having a seat at the table to an extent and being able to have people on the inside that are pushing for diplomacy is hugely important in de-escalating conflict. And the conflict in Syria actually could have been so much worse, believe it or not, because it happened as bad as it was. It could have been significantly worse had there not been those few, handful of people inside the Obama administration, not there to push for diplomacy at some turns. It did happen. I mean, people aren't aware of what happens behind the scenes, but that stuff is hugely important. As far as citizen engagement, there are a few members of Congress who do listen to the left. Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib, AOC to some degree, the squad. These people are in office because they don't take corporate money and because they have support from a certain base of the Democratic Party, a base of the Democratic Party that does lean more left. And so they are, open to being pressured on issues. And I think it's been great because actually they have been pushed on domestic issues, on issues, of economic equality. And that's really important, but we need to also be doing that on foreign policy. We need to be, I'm not saying that that's the only way you change things, right, is from the inside and reforming, but I think it's really important that we attach the issues of foreign policy, of let's stop ruining Syria, let's stop ruining Venezuela, to domestic leftist policies. Because at the end of the day, we don't have healthcare in America, right? We have all this student loan debt. Our infrastructure is crumbling. People are hungry. They're not getting money from the government, but we're spending all this money on this bloated Pentagon budget. And we're spending all this money funding, civil society groups to destabilize other countries. Stop. Let's stop doing that. Let's stop intervening around the world to just empower a handful of elites and start investing that money at home. And I think it's a really easy argument to make. And I actually I've been disappointed that I haven't seen these particular members of Congress being pushed on these issues. So I think that's a space for opportunity, especially now that Trump won't be president. And it won't all be about how to defeat Trump and how to be against Trump. We can actually have some more discussions about things beyond just Donald Trump. He won't dominate everything we talk about. I think it does present a huge opportunity to sort of push these squad members. And then of course it's the way I organizing on the ground activism, local stuff like what you guys are doing in Massachusetts sounds super important. Things like this, but need to continue happening and continue building. But I can't really lecture to organizers and activists because I'm not, that's not my area of expertise.
Well, we appreciate your opinions. Thanks for that. So it's looking like we have time for one, maybe two more questions, and then we'll wrap this up. Let's take a question from Omar. He's been asking to ask his question for the event. Omar, please.
Hello there. Hi, Rania. So I followed your work actually since a long time, and actually I was also a friend of Ben Norton. And I noticed that if you go back to about 2014, you used to have a different narrative. You used to say that the US actually joined Syria in joined Assad in bombing Syria. You used to say that Israel is worried about a US Hezbollah rapprochement. And used to say that even ISIS held areas would now fall under US and Israeli bombs. And actually in 2014, the Assad regime welcomed US airstrikes in Syria. And if I could share the screen, I could show you the articles by Walid al-Muallim saying airstrikes are going in the right direction, and Ali Haidar saying Syria is okay with airstrikes. And of course, you mentioned the war on terror a few times, but you also have Assad himself saying that thousands of Syrians have carried up arms against the state and millions of Syrians are supporting terrorism. So what happened between 2014 and 2016? The US bombed a lot of rebel groups even before Russia intervened, and I'm talking about mainstream rebel groups that were not designated as terrorists, so I'm excluding Jabhat al-Nusra even, okay? And then the US, of course, the US coordinated intelligence with the Assad regime, and in 2016, late 2016, this was Washington Post, I think, the US actually supported an offensive by Hezbollah and other Iranian militias to take Palmyra from ISIS in late 2016 and early 2017. Yet you, Ben Norton, and Max Blumenthal, you all changed your position in 2016, even though you were actually arguing that the US was supporting Assad before that. So why would that happen? Now, the only explanation that I could get...
Do you want me to answer your question, or do you want to put words in my mouth? I get where your question's going. I'd like to answer it for you. So you're right. I did used to have a different position on Syria, and I'm open about that. And I've discussed why my position on Syria changed. And I think that I was, like I say, there was so much propaganda around Syria. It was very difficult to get accurate information. There was this whole media ecosystem that was funded by the US government, by the UK government, by the Saudis, by the Qataris, that gave a false narrative about what was happening, a very whitewashed narrative. And I fell for it. And I've admitted that I fell for it. And I think Max and Ben have discussed that too. And I think that's okay. I think it's okay to get something wrong and then get it right. I was never pro-intervention in Syria. I always maintained an opposition to intervention. And what really changed my opinion on Syria is I had relatives who were surrounded by jihadist groups, and I didn't want them to die. Jihadist groups that the US policy empowered and helped arm. So that's what played a significant role in helping me understand the conflict better. And then also going there myself. One of the problems with Syria is you have all this media coming out of opposition areas, but nothing coming out of government areas where the vast majority of Syrians lived even throughout the conflict. So I visited government areas. I have Lebanese citizenship, so it's easier for me to do that than Westerners. And I was able to see for myself that this is a much more nuanced, complicated issue than I had understood. It's not black and white. It's not government good, opposition evil, or opposition good, government evil. It's a war, and we need it to end. And what the US is actually prolonging that war. So, my interest in Syria has always been de-escalation, less violence. I want this war to end. And that is why I'm opposed. I became opposed and continue to oppose the US involvement there and the involvement of its allies there, because it has prolonged the war, it prolonged the bloodshed, and the US arming and funding of jihadist militias across Syria to collapse the government it didn't like led to the rise of ISIS. That's why the Syrian government supported, the Syrian government didn't mind when the US bombed ISIS areas, because ISIS was a threat to Syrians across Syria. ISIS was a huge threat. In fact, the people who died the most fighting ISIS were Syrian soldiers and Iraqis. Iranians died fighting ISIS. In fact, America's biggest adversaries paid the biggest toll fighting ISIS and dying at their hands. ISIS, a creation of conditions that American foreign policy created. So I get worked up about this issue because it's personal to me, because of the region I come from. It's not some abstract issue. I'm here to see it. I'm not here to push anyone's agenda. I am here to tell you that what I've seen, and what I've seen doesn't resemble what you read in the Washington Post and the New York Times. And I will say, I have been to Syria with delegations of journalists from the Washington Post and from the New York Times and from NPR and all of these mainstream outlets, The Guardian. We saw the same things. We were there together. We saw the same stuff. They didn't care. They didn't care. Not all of them. It's not fair to paint them all with the same brush, but a significant number of them did not care. And that tells you something. A significant number of them didn't care about what happened to people living in Aleppo on the side that was controlled by the Syrian government, where people were also dying and had been besieged by the opposition. I mean, this was a two-way fight. It wasn't one side was getting bombed. There was two sides fighting each other, and one of them happened to be extremely reactionary and have a genocidal agenda against minorities. And the US was supporting that side. So that's what changed my mind on Syria.
Yeah, and that's exactly why we brought you on to talk about it, because we don't get that type of perspective, as you mentioned, from somebody like the Washington Post or the New York Times. So it's really important that we hear. And people on this call and people in general are adults. We can take different arguments and make up our own minds. So anyways, I'm going to pass the floor to Brian to close off the program. For my part, I'm just going to say, Rania, thank you so much for joining us today. We really enjoyed listening to you and learning from you and getting the chance to talk to you. Thank you to everyone for being with us today. You got to listen to Rania for yourself and make up your own mind about what a terrible person she is. And,
Did I convince you?
well,
am I as bad as they say?
I don't think so. I don't know if I'm missing anything over here, but anyways, Rania, do you have anything, any last words you want to leave us with?
I just want to say thank you for inviting me to speak and to share my perspective. And thank you, all of you, for all of the work that you do. And, you know, thank you for allowing this to happen despite some people being against it. I think it's really important that we're able to hear people out, even if we disagree with them.
Yeah, and I'll just say that, you know, all the controversy around it, it creates more publicity. There's more people listening
that's
right
true.
now
Thank you.
because
So
of it.
thank you. Thank you
So-
to all those people who got angry.
Yes, thank you to them. Brian, please.
Yeah, thanks, Amar, and thanks, Rania. Your work makes our work a lot easier. So I just want to thank you for that. We knew this was a controversial subject, and we don't shy away from controversy. We're an anti-war group in a country that has been at war now for almost 20 years. So our very existence is deeply controversial. So we don't shy away from that at all. We welcome that. And I think the one thing that everyone on this call should be able to agree on is that the United States is actively intervening in Syria right now, a sovereign country. And how would we feel here in the United States if Syrian troops were occupying parts of our country? And I think that really goes to show that a lot of us here in America have really believed in American exceptionalism so much that we think that the rules just don't apply to us. But we're here to say that that's not true. The majority of people in this country and around the world are sick of America's never-ending war in the Middle East. It's long past time to end this madness. We need to stop intervening. We need to stop telling other people who should be in charge of their government. We need to stop flooding other countries with guns and bombs and expecting a good outcome from that. I think those are pretty basic points that we should all be able to agree on. So if that speaks to you and what you would like to do with your activism, I encourage you to please check us out at Massachusetts Peace Action and think about joining us. We do a lot of advocacy around the world for peace and justice, for a more peaceful foreign policy from the United States. So I invite you to join us. We run on the donations of time from activists and volunteers just like you. So we're going to be sending a follow-up email with a recording of this wonderful talk by Rania and ways for you to get directly involved. And I really hope that you take that opportunity, because if we don't do anything, then nothing will change. And this country and the world desperately needs change right now. So before we sign off, I just want to give Rania one last opportunity. Where can people find your work and how can they support your work?
So I post Soapbox. You can follow Soapbox on Instagram and Facebook. Follow me on Twitter at Rania Khalek. Follow our podcast, Left Bitches. I also host Unauthorized Disclosure with Kevin Gostola, another excellent independent journalist who's been covering, you know, the threat against whistleblowers, especially Julian Assange. And also my website, raniakhalek.com. I try to post my work there as regularly as possible.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for
we
having
really
me.
appreciate all the time, and look out for that follow-up email. It will include a link to this recording, and please share it widely. Thanks everyone for joining us, and have a great day.
Bye guys. Thank you.
Peace.